typically played game one card that Reanimator struggles to beat, and Jim without it in his list.
Yeah, so this is, once again, as we've seen a lot on camera, the game ones can be pretty difficult for Esper Stoneblade. Usually game 2 and 3, though, they are the favorite when they play against these unfair decks. I would expect to see more of the same here.
Yeah. So Chris VanMeter on your left, Jim Davis on the right, both 5-0. Both players with a lengthy Open Series and Invitational resume. Jim, not much of a traveler for events, but I believe he lives somewhere in, I don't know if he lives in New York City or upstate New York, but I know he's a New York State resident. Baltimore, 4 or 5 or 6 hour drive, depending where he's from. And Chris, as we talked about before, traveling to just about everything so far this year.
Yeah, Chris based in Roanoke, Virginia, making the trip up to Baltimore for this tournament.
Star City Games employee and featured writer on the website. And what's really surprised me about, Chris and Brad and Todd, that crew of Roanoke players that are all playing together, they've shown a willingness week to week to be playing different decks. When you're playtesting a lot, you're often just, all right, I know this one deck, I'm going to play at all these events. I don't have a lot of time to switch it up or learn new decks, but it really is a testament to the amount of Magic these guys are playing, where they feel comfortable and confident week to week changing the deck they're playing.
All right, well, looks like what will probably be a mulligan for Chris. You see a 1-lander there, no castable cards. And we'll see when that Jim gets a keepable hand. Jim's hand, not particularly strong either. 5 lands, Brainstorm, Force of Will. Now, both these players high enough profile that there's a decent chance they know what the other one's on.
Yeah. Now, Jim's hand is pretty bad. If there was no fetch land in this hand, I'm positive it's not keepable. The fact that Brainstorm plus fetch land gives him the potential to get some spells and get rid of these excess lands might convince Jim to keep, but he's going to send it back as well.
All right, so we have a 6-on-6. That, in my mind at least, favors Chris here. Chris really doesn't need 6 cards to assemble his combo. If he gets, the land, Entomb, Exhume, the other cards often cannot matter in this matchup.
Unlike a deck like Ad Nauseam Tendrils, which is about a saturation of spells, and every mulligan is potentially very bad for this deck, Reanimator is what I like to call an A plus B combo deck. It's trying to assemble something like Entomb Reanimate or Show and Tell plus a large creature in the hand. These sort of decks are a little more durable to mulligans than the saturation decks like Elves or Storm.
Absolutely. So you see both players on 6 here. Chris also will be on the play. That puts a lot of pressure on Jim to have a 1-mana answer to what Chris is doing. Most of Chris's Reanimate combos, or at least the ones he has as an opener, happen on turn 2. Remember, Reanimator is one of the faster decks. So we have things like Entomb Reanimate, Entomb Exhume, Careful Study Exhume. Even something like Lotus Petal Show and Tell oftentimes happens on turn 2 because Jim's on the draw. His real ways of interacting will be Swords to Plowshares, if it works, Force of Will, and Thoughtseize.
And Chris pulls up a solid-looking 6-card hand of Entomb, some cantrips, and a Show and Tell.
Yeah, it's another 1-lander, but this is the kind of 1-lander he can keep. Jim's hand also another land flood, but it does have Force of Will plus blue cards, so it looks like both players will be keeping on 6. And rather than Careful Study turn 1, Chris is just going to go ahead and play his fetch land and not sack it.
Please report to the stage.
Presumably, he wants to take this extra shot to find another land. And we see on end step, Chris is going to go ahead and sacrifice 4 Underground Sea. And he's going to Entomb on end step. So no need for Careful Study. He's just going to go straight for the combo here. And it's Gristlebrand in the yard.
Jim with a hand of 2 Force of Wills and a Supreme Verdict, so he decides Entomb is not the card that he wants to fight over. He's going to save it for a potential reanimation spell.
We see Show and Tell and Careful Study in Chris's hand. And does he have the Reanimate spell? He has Thoughtseize, he has some Brainstorms. No Reanimate as of yet. He's going to lead off with Brainstorm, hopefully to find the land he needs, and or the Reanimation spell or the land. And he's successful on one of those fronts. He draws 2 lands. One of them is a fetch land.
Fetch land is really critical here. as it allows Chris to shuffle away some of this unnecessary stuff.
Yeah, it looks like he's going to get rid of a Careful Study and another card here. And that means he will be able to follow this up with Land Thoughtseize. He's going to make sure to use the Misty Rainforest to do it so that he can clear off the top of his deck. And this is actually a low-impact Thoughtseize right now.
Sure. He can't really keep Jim off of Force of Will, nor does Jim have anything really good in his hand, so. It still at least informs Chris that Force of Will is a card he needs to fight through, so that's meaningful.
And we see that here. Thoughtseize, Jim's hand, Force of Will, Swords, Supreme Verdict, lands. So you think he'll probably take a Force of Will here. I can't imagine he's too concerned about Swords or Supreme Verdict. Supreme Verdict's just a really slow Swords.
Yeah, even if Jim is immediately able to plow or Supreme Verdict away something like Gristlebrand, the damage is already done.
Yeah, Chris will draw 7 and almost certainly have the combo again, if not a Force of Will for the Swords.
Yep. I imagine that long-term the fight is over cards like Force of Will. That's what I would anticipate Chris takes here. It is not ideal that Jim has 2 of them in his hand. You're not really keeping him off anything, but you have additional discard spells you can draw on it. Certainly forces Jim to play conservative with the blue cards he has.
Yep, Jace the Mind Sculptor is a draw for Jim. So now that gives Jim a proactive game plan as opposed to a purely reactive one. That said, he's still got a few lands to go before he gets there. He'll just play land past the turn. And so Chris knows he has to fight through 1 Force of Will. He has a Show and Tell. There's a chance he could just cast Show and, even without the monster, he may at some point cast Show and Tell just to get rid of a force. Just gonna go ahead and first brainstorm here. With a fetch land up, that's powerful. He does have Iona and Careful Study now in hand. And now the Show and Tell is no longer a bluff. Yeah, she does have the monster to put in his hand. He's going to put back the 4th land and the Careful Study.
These have been some really powerful brainstorms from VanMeter thus far. He's gotten to really engineer a game plan, get rid of some of the redundant big stuff or Careful Studies that he really doesn't have any way to set up.
Yeah, and he's actually going to go ahead and fetch away the Careful Study. I was wondering whether or not he was going to keep it, just because if he expects that the Show and Tell is going to get Force of Willed, he will want a way to get rid of the Iona after the Show and Tell. That said, he's going to shuffle it, so the Iona may sit in his hand for a while.
Well, I think that Chris's game plan may be, he has a Gristlebrand in the graveyard, he has Iona in his hand. If any of these actually enter play, he's in really good shape to win the game. And so he just wants to leave himself with as many live draws as possible to, if he keeps the Iona in his hand, then the other Show and Tell in his deck is a live draw.
Yeah, and he found Careful Study again. This brainstorm had Force of Will, Fetch Land, Careful Study. The land and Careful Study will once again go on top of the deck, but now when he goes for the combo, he will have Force plus blue card.
Yeah.
Which would be enough to make Iona. Iona would have to, interestingly enough, Show and Telling Iona into play is not a game winner here. Iona has to name white because he knows about the Supreme Verdict and the Swords to Plowshares. But then once it does, Jim will be able to just cast Jace and unsummon the Iona.
Yeah. So it actually surprised me if this Show and Tell was sort of a test.
Yeah.
Chris might not actually fight over this. Because Jim has to respect this because of the possibility of Gristlebrand. So this may force a Force of Will out of Jim regardless. It is risky, though, he doesn't know about the Jace in Jim's hand. He picked that up after the Thoughtseize. So Chris still might want to fight over the Show and Tell, but he's putting Jim in a tough spot.
So your guess is that if Jim forces here, Chris may not even want to force back.
Yeah, I think he will, because we're talking about basically just Jace is the card that punishes him. But if he's playing a more conservative game plan, he might say, oh, okay.
It's going to happen. Marsh Flats into play, Iona into play. All right, well, Chris will name white. He knows that there's a white answer. And this is a really heads-up play by Jim. I really like it.
It's gutsy. I mean, that's a gutsy play there, but...
Yeah, I mean, if it was Gristlebrand, Jim would lose there.
Possibly. I mean, he's not dead for sure,
not
but
for sure,
it's
it's bad.
It's definitely bad.
So he will name blue with the Iona.
Okay, so he's willing to cut Jim off of Force of Will and now just fight over the plow.
Well, that's interesting because he knows there's a plow and a Supreme Verdict.
Right.
But Verdict is blue. So,
Yeah.
yeah, you can go ahead and force over the swords. Now, you know, I'd missed this line originally when thinking about it, but because Chris can actually successfully win this fight, I do have to wonder, you know, are there any creatures that Chris can put into play which aren't scary for Jim? You know, if this was Gristlebrand, Jim would lose or be in a bad spot. And he's not in a good spot with this Iona. I'm wondering why, you know, why no Force of Will?
I think that with Chris only having 2 cards left in his hand, he thought he would be able to fight over whatever came into play. Chris has to have Force of Will blue spell to really punish him for this.
Right. And now Chris's hand completely empty, but Jim unable to cast any of the cards in his hand. They are all blue. Draws True Name Nemesis, so 4 blue cards staring down an Iona set to blue. Jim will have no plays. He has 3 turns to find something. And had he drawn a Stoneforge that turn, he could have tried to race with Batterskull or buy extra turns with Batterskull, but now that won't hit in time. So it's really Swords to Plowshares or bust at this point.
Really heads up play from Chris here.
Yep, Jim down to 5. He's got 1 more turn to find the 1 mana instant. Will he hit it? He's probably going to crack some number of his fetch lands here, I would think.
Yeah.
Maybe even all.
Just trying to thin out his deck a little bit, increase the odds that he draws a plow.
Yeah, it's not a big percentage increase by cracking those fetch lands, but it is an increase.
It's greater than 0, so.
Yeah, so it depends if he thinks there's any utility to those lands later on that's worth saving 1, 2. And nope, he's going to sack them all, go to 2. And find some more dual lands.
Again, not even Snapcaster Mage is a draw for Jim, even with the plow in the graveyard, as that is also cut off by Iona. Vindicate is another draw that Jim has. He has a main deck Vindicate.
All right. And we will see what, yep. So he's drawing to 1 of 4 outs here. See if he can hit it. He's got a turn. And it is Stoneforge Mystic. It's not a blue spell, but it's also not a spell that saves him. Game 1 will go to Chris VanMeter.
Really well executed game by Chris there. That was an impressive display. Looked like Jim had all the tools there to fight over, fight over spells, and had answers even if something was able to sneak into play. But Chris correctly identified the color he was supposed to name, cut Jim off of every card in his hand, and we'll be moving on to the sideboard.
All right, so we've watched this a couple times. Jim and his board gets a lot of hateful options here.
Yeah, he gets 2 copies of Thoughtseize, a Grafdigger's Cage, 2 Meddling Mages, 2 Rest in Peace, a Flush's Storm, a Path to Exile, a Surgical Extraction, a Vendilion Click, and additional Supreme Verdict. He has, not all these are the most efficient things in the world, mind you, but he has a lot of ways to interact with the graveyard, certainly, a lot more disruption, a lot more permission.
Yeah, I was going to say, in particular, his sideboard looks to be going at the graveyard, is what I would say.
Yes.
And that will be excellent in this matchup. This will get significantly harder for Chris. On Chris's side, he does have some ways to fight back. As we saw before, he has massacres, or potential massacres for a Meddling Mage. A lot of the time, we actually see Reanimator, post-board, go up to 4 show and tells after the sideboard, and he will that's something I do think he will do here. He can board in show and tells, City of Traders, who I think come in on the show and tell plan. Other than that, he has some other cards which are different monsters to bring into play. He has Inkwell Leviathan. That one actually can be pretty decent in this matchup. Jim doesn't actually have a good way to interact with Inkwell Leviathan like he does with things like, you saw like Iona wasn't completely safe there.
Right.
Inkwell is pretty safe. It's almost just a better Iona. He has Ashen Rider. I'm not positive Ashen Rider is played in this matchup, but
I would suspect not. I think what he wants, I think he'll want the Pithy Needle, a very good answer to Stoneforge Mystic and Jace. which are valuable tools that Jim has. And yeah, he definitely wants to go on the show and tell plan. It's basically for decks where you don't think they can capitalize on you casting show and tell, which Esper Stoneblade traditionally doesn't. And also decks that are going to be attacking your graveyard, so you want a different angle of attack. It's also just valuable against decks that are going to be attacking your hand. The extra redundancy is a nice thing.
Yeah, so then there are things in Chris's sideboard which we could talk about. He has cards like Spell Pierce and Thoughtseize. Certainly those are cards that he play against the combo decks that are even faster than him, of which there aren't too many, but they do exist. How much do you like them, though, against a control deck? Does he want to play Spell Pierce offensively? Does he want to play Thoughtseize offensively?
I'm not an enormous fan of it because against decks that are bringing in Thoughtseizes and Duress and that class of spells, because you can't afford to trade your resources that way. If you trade 1-for-1 with them a bunch and try to wear down the resources, the Esper Stoneblade deck has a pretty big advantage in that fight because you're trying to play a normal game of Magic, and they are really well situated to play that sort of game. So I like having the discard stuff against decks where, they're going to be faster than you. They're also trying to do explosive things. Against decks that are trading 1-for-1, I'm less interested in. Now, there is an argument here that for Chris to go exclusively into a show and tell plan, maybe he's willing to concede the graveyard fight against a deck like Esper Stoneblade, convert just into a show and tell package, and in that world, he probably needs to bring in cards like Thoughtseize and Spell Pierce because he has too many cards to sideboard out. Yeah,
he would have Entombs, Exhumes, Reanimates, even Careful Studies. Probably keeps in the Careful Studies just because, you can't actually board out 16 cards.
Right.
But
so I don't know if he's going to go completely off the deep end here and cut all the reanimation stuff, but there is an argument that a deck like Esper Stoneblade likely has too many cards for you to fight through on that axis.
Yeah, certainly cards like Entomb become pretty suspect here.
If Jim's going to be bringing in a bunch of discard spells and he's going to be bringing in a bunch of other hate cards, it's hard to fight through everything. So there is an argument for just conceding one of the battles.
Absolutely. Going to those post-board games, Chris can become a weaker show and tell deck, but that's not really, so going on Jim's side, that's not an unknown strategy. A lot of players expect Reanimator to turn into a show and tell deck. Does that affect the amount of graveyard hate that Jim brings in?
No, I think the upside's still too high. And Jim has a lot of cards that are not that efficient in the matchup. He's got, maybe he needs to keep in True Name Nemesis to have a sufficient clock, but he has some of those. He has some removal spells that aren't their best here. He has a Stoneforge Mystic plan where he can de-emphasize that a little bit because a lot of his equipment's not very powerful in the matchup. So there's definitely enough ways for him to make room for the graveyard cards, and if you're not bringing them in here, then why are you having them in your sideboard at all,
Yeah, absolutely. So Jim will be on the play this game. As we see, that does give him more options. Last, round game one, we saw that Chris is still kind of a turn 2 speed deck. It takes away a lot of the tools that Jim has.
And these post-board games, you should see a much more streamlined Esper Blade deck.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it gets rid of so many of its dead cards. All right, both players have their 7s. Looks like we are about to be underway. Jim's still contemplating his keep.
Jim is a pretty methodical player.
Yeah. And starts off on a turn 1 Grafdigger's Cage. Certainly has boarded in the graveyard hate.
And Chris either can't or chooses not to fight over that.
Yeah, he does have some petals of his own. He looks like he has petals, and Chris has boarded in the Spell Pierces. So that certainly seems to suggest that he might be on the all show and tell plan that you were talking about.
I believe there was also an Entomb in his hand, so he still might have some of that going on, but.
Yeah, he has Gristlebrand. You are right, it is an Entomb in hand. He doesn't have a way to get Cage off the board, I don't believe. So that plan simply won't work. I mean, he has one Echoing Truth in his board. That could have been brought in.
Yeah.
Thoughtseize cast by Chris VanMeter. He sees Meddling Mage, Stoneforge Mystic, Second Land, Supreme Verdict. Let's talk about this. The verdicts have been left in Jim's deck. And
I actually believe that is a Meddling Mage.
Yeah.
Supreme Verdict.
Oh, the verdict is the fourth one down as well.
The second to the left, yes.
Now, is Verdict something he actively wants in this matchup, or simply just too far down the list of cards he's not thrilled about?
Probably the latter.
All right, and we see in VanMeter's hand, he does have a Gristlebrand, Entomb, Spell Pierce, and some lands, so still searching for that show and tell.
But this is a place where, you know, Jim is definitely exposed to show and tell.
Yeah, he's exposed to it. So what he does here is he plays toward the fact that, you know, Jim has actually a decent proactive game plan. And because Chris's deck only plays 4 show and tells now, it's actually not too terribly quick. You know, it has to find one of these 4 ofs. It doesn't have too many ways to find cards. Jim actually may just race him on the proactive axis here. You know, all right, well, race. Yeah, can you race the Stoneforge Mystic? And that's a lot of pressure on Chris.
Yeah, Chris does not have a lot of time. And all those draws from the sword, you know, those could be additional discard spells, additional counters. It's not just about the damage.
Absolutely. So yeah, that's Stoneforge gets Sword of Fire Ice. Now we'll see if Chris can find a show and tell in time. And we are back over to Chris. Draw for the turn. He has just another land. Gonna play fetch land and pass.
And a big draw for Jim there. He finds a Force of Will. It's a really big preventive measure here.
All right. He does have the Force Will, and with the Verdict, that is one thing, I guess, when you were talking about keeping in Supreme Verdict, at least it has islands in its mana cost. So that's kind of one of the bigger jokes in Legacy, always that, you know, a card can't be that bad as long as you can pitch it to Force of Will.
Yeah.
And we see Careful Study for Chris.
Pitch to Force of Will and Shuffle Away with Brainstorm has been used to justify any number of blue cards.
Any blue card that says, yeah, shuffle away. All right. It looks like he's going to discard the Entomb, discard another land. He found another Careful Study. Each of these Careful Studies is actually his card disadvantage as he casts it. And we'll see crack another fetch land. So, yeah, kind of like single shot Faithless Lootings here. No utility by putting cards in the graveyard. He's actually just trying to find a show and tell. It's just digging.
And actually, this would have been actually a pretty powerful thing for Chris to be doing, with the exception now that Jim has found Force of Will. So removing the total number of raw resources he has to work with is going to be a pretty big cost as this game proceeds.
All right, Careful Study number 2 finds a black card. Finds, I believe, the show and tell he was looking for. He does have a Spell Pierce as well. If Jim makes the mistake of tapping mana on his own turn, Chris may be able to sneak past that Force of Will.
And it wouldn't surprise me here to see Chris make use of the Massacre in his hand to try to compel Jim to use mana on his own turn again to get something into play.
Yeah, once you have a Stoneforge in play, the Vesper Stoneblade player very rarely taps mana main phase. You know, he'll have to tap 2 at one point to equip the Stoneforge, but that's about it. We see a pretty lean keep here from Chris. It is Massacre, Show and Tell Gristlebrand, Spell Pierce. And I do think that means he's looking to Massacre it right now.
Yeah. Well, if he doesn't Massacre right now, there's a chance he doesn't get to Massacre for the remainder of the game. Because Jim may not need to do anything else except put that sword on that Stoneforge Mystic and then protect himself with counter spells and discard spells.
Absolutely. So we'll see that Massacre cast. Chris does have a Swamp. Jim does have a Plains. That will cost 0. And now Jim has to decide whether or not he wants to force.
I would be surprised if this was the battle that Jim chose to fight.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be the one he wants to fight. This is an uncommon from Nemesis. Massacre, because it's part of that same cycle as Submerge, always has the potential to see play. I think certainly has risen in the amount of play it sees with decks like Reanimator, because Death and Taxes is now a deck in the metagame.
A lot more Meddling Mages than there used to be.
Meddling Mages. There's a lot more reasons to be playing Massacre. And we see before Stoneforge dies, on its way out, it finds a Sword of Fire and Ice. Jim is going to replace the Stoneforge Mystic, but the real question Chris has is, 1, whether or not Jim has a 4th land, and 2, whether or not Chris can find a 4th mana source.
Yeah. If Chris is able to find a 4th mana source, he can then show and tell with Pierce backup.
And that should be sufficient. But a lot of things have to break his way. Jim has to not have land in it, and really Chris has to have the land.
Yeah.
But he's given him a chance. step one, no land from Jim. That one has succeeded. All right, if Chris can draw a land here, I think he will get it. And he does. Two things need to break his way, both of them do. And now Chris is pedal to the metal. He is going forward with the combo. Show and tell being cast.
And all those careful studies, Chris has used basically every single resource to get to this point.
Well, you even felt bad last turn because saw they had to discard a second card off that careful study. You knew you wanted to get rid of the Entomb, and you're like, oh, is he going to discard the Massacre or the Misty? He needed the Misty. He had to top deck the answer. And now we see it. Force of Will hits Show and Tell. Spell Pierce hits Force of Will. Show and Tell will resolve. One card left in Chris's hand, and he knows. And it's a good one.
Yeah. This is a replay, to some extent, of game one, where Chris had to use basically every part of the Buffalo to get to this spot. He had to get his Iona play, use the last two cards in his hand, were Force of Will, blue card. And now we have a repeat here with Chris squeezing every ounce out of his deck to get this Griselbrand into play.
And now we are not out of the blue just yet. Chris does get to draw up to 14 cards here, but if Jim finds a blue source, Jim can cast Jace. Chris will have to have a Force of Will for the Jace. So there's a shot for Jim. If Jim can draw the blue and Chris cannot draw a Force plus blue card, then Jim can get it.
Yeah.
But things certainly got a lot tougher. And we see Lotus Petal played for Chris. He drew 7. A lot of his other cards still don't do too much. Reanimate. He has another Massacre here, which he's going to go ahead and fire off. Sees no reason not to.
Yeah, this is another spot of, if not now, then when?
Right. If your Griselbrand stays alive, are you really concerned about anything happening?
Yeah.
That means you get to draw 7 cards a turn. We'll just cast the Massacre for free. That'll take care of Stoneforge Mystic. And if you're Jim, if you had waited a turn on that second Stoneforge, you might have been able. That's a lot to play around, and maybe things would get worse if you wait.
Right. The problem is the alternative there is just saying go, and that's a very dangerous.
To do nothing.
That's a very dangerous road to pursue as well.
All right, Careful Study. The Lotus Petal is used to cast Careful Study. Chris trying to digging 2 cards deeper. He has a lot of dead cards because of Grafdigger's Cage. As you see, City of Traders, Reanimate, put into the bin. And now, step 1, can Jim find a blue mana source? He does not. It has been Vendilion Click. And now that he has missed on casting Jace, the window appears to be closing for Jim Davis.
And we'll probably next turn get to see the extent to which Chris is cited in his disruption.
Right.
He's going to probably be looking at a lot more cards. And
probably draw 7 more. Maybe do it during Jim's upkeep, but...
Yeah. And that Vendilion Click isn't even castable right now, as Jim is on Plains and Scrubland as 2 of his 3 mana sources.
Right. Now, he needed a blue mana source that turn. Jim suits up the Germ token. It's a 6/6, but 6/6 is not 7/7. And he has no plays and passes back.
And among the cards that Chris has drawn is, I believe he's found his singleton copy of
Echoing Truth,
which is really powerful against Jim's equipment.
It's powerful against Grafdigger's Cage. It's powerful against Germ Token.
Mm-hmm.
It's, I don't know what he wants to Echoing Truth, but they're all pretty good.
Yeah.
And the hit from Griselbrand does connect. Jim goes from 19 down to 12. Chris from 9 up to 16. And now the card drawing will begin anew. 7 more cards into Chris's hand. And Jim can do nothing but sit by and watch as the resources accumulate on his opponent's side of the board. See, all right, City of Traders is the land for the turn. And there's so many plays he can make now. We see he can Show and Tell. Iona appears into play. He has
Not
Spell Pierce, yeah.
Not a bad backup complementary piece to Griselbrand, Iona.
Yeah, Griselbrand and Iona. Just in case you thought you could remove the Griselbrand, and he's going to do just that. Cast Show and Tell. Well, Jim will get a Vendilion Click. And click. All right, he gets to choose if he wants to target himself or target Chris. He actually gets to find out what color Chris names. No, he has to target before he knows what color Chris names. I believe. No. He gets to pick out the color
Iona's
first.
as an as.
As an as, so he gets to find out what color. And then I guess if Chris' name is blue, Jim can target himself.
Yeah.
To get rid of the Jace. Yeah, the whole as versus trigger can be a little touch and go. Now, no, that has to do with whose turn it is, correct? If it was Jim's turn, he'd still have to pick the trigger first. Or maybe not even. He names blue regardless.
Right.
But Vendilion Click will hit Chris, not Jim. You can see his hand. It is Exhume, Brainstorm, Careful Study, Spell Pierce. I suppose the relevant cards would be Spell Pierce, Echoing Truth, and then a redundant copy of Show and Tell Gristlebrand. And I think Jim wisely takes the Echoing Truth.
It's the card with the most meaningful text box at this stage.
And unfortunately, he draws him into a Force of Will.
Not shabby.
He may have even improved Chris's hand. But with Iona on blue, I think that should take care of all the outs that Jim has here, especially with that Force of Will now in Chris's hand.
Yeah, before it was still, potentially a card like Vindicate might make a difference here, but the Force of Will really cements it.
And this should be one turn left. We will make sure it happens out that way. Chris, we are still in his main phase. After he drew 7, cast and made Iona off Show and Tell. Looks like he's going to head and move to his discard step. And he'll take care of some of the more redundant cards in his hand. Whether that's Crystal
Yeah,
Brand.
he has a lot of backup. He has a lot of backup reanimation that he doesn't really need because of Grafdigger's Cage. He has redundant Gristlebrand's in hand. Those shorts are set to discard. I think we still might be in his second main phase. He's deciding if he wants to just keep.
Yeah, he's actually brainstorming instead of careful. He's going to brainstorm. He could careful study here as well. Card disadvantage obviously doesn't matter too much. He brainstorms into another Gristlebrand, some fetch lands. Just going to put a bunch of those 7/7 demons on top of his deck. He has actually the one in play and the other 3 in hand now. So he's found the whole set. They are back on top. And that he's going to go ahead and discard a Show and Tell. Oh, those are the cards he wants to keep.
Yeah.
He's doing it by exclusion. What does he need in his hand? Counting his way up to 7. Looks like he's going to go ahead and discard Land Exhume.
Still shoving a couple things around here, but the most critical thing for Chris to keep here is the spell piece of the Force of Will, another blue card. After that, it's all fairly incidental. Another blue card to draw for Jim. As big as that germ is, it's no match for the threats that Chris has in play.
Right. And we'll pass with the cleanup step having been taken care of. We'll pass back to Jim. I don't know if Jim has a draw here. We will see.
Yeah, he drew Force of Will this turn. Another card locked out by Iona.
Another blue card. And he can survive the next turn with the help of a chump block, but the path from there is unclear.
If it's any consolation to Jim, this probably wouldn't have been any better if he was playing Goblins.
Yeah. This isn't a particularly good matchup for Goblins either. In that situation, Chris often finds Elishnorn, a card that's somewhat difficult for Goblins to beat.
Jim just trying to find some way to proceed here. He may essentially need to offer up a suicide attack from the germ here just to gain enough life to survive combat next turn.
Right. And so we have a swing here, both creatures. Iona blocks a germ token. Chris will go ahead and gain, or Jim will gain 6 life. That brings him up to 18. And then he's going to start moving equipment over to Vendilion Click. Gets Chris to 6. I'm not sure if there's an out here for him though.
No, Jim is a type of player. I mean, Jim plays it out to the end. That's just
right. What I'm wondering is the out he's playing to. If there is something he's like. Sometimes you take losing board states, and this is a sign of actually a lot of strong players do that, and they'll think, what's a misplay my opponent could make, and how do I play into a situation where I can capitalize on it?
Chris getting too aggressive with Gristlebrand here is a possibility. You see him play a land, which causes him to lose City of Traders. Again, we're talking about, you know, long shots in any case.
Absolutely.
But with Chris having a permanent in play that allows him to pay a lot of life if he wants to, you know, it's not out of the question that some horrible mistake could occur here.
All right, so we fetch here.
I believe he failed to find.
Yep, he did not have a land in his deck. So he does blow up his own land there. He's in a careful study.
Small mistake number one, you know.
There you go. All right,
Jim,
he's playing to him right there.
all right, I'll have my opponent pay a life and stone rate himself twice. That's a good start.
All right, go ahead and discard 2 more cards there off the careful study. It's another Gristlebrand in the yard. And then we will, looks like we're about ready to move to the attack step. We're going to get the Angel Demon team in there. Maybe just the Demon. That'll put Jim. Let's see if it's the one. It's just the Gristlebrand. That'll put Jim down to 11. Chris up to 12.
Yeah, this instead of attacking with Iona, he cuts off Chris of a draw through the Vendilion Click, saves himself some damage.
And on Polluted Delta is the draw for Jim. He is right now, if he can hit land 4 and 5, he can move the Batter Skull over to Vendilion Click, which means that he can actually trade it with a Gristlebrand or the Iona.
Well, the problem is that he has to chump block this coming turn.
Unfortunately, he does have to chump block this turn. And as he can't cast blue cards, he doesn't have anything in his hand that is useful at the moment. We'll see where Chris goes from here. You have to think he'll just swing both creatures and force the chump block.
First order of business, he's going to draw 7, it looks like.
Sure, Chris down to 12. 7 more cards. I think just loading himself up on Force of Wills just in case something goes awry.
Yeah.
He does find another Force of Will plus blue card combo. He now has triple force backup for whatever he's doing.
Just being incredibly cautious.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and ponder. I think he just wants the perfect hand here. He's going to shuffle off the ponder. I'm curious what hand he's sculpting. It looks like he almost has an ideal 7. Okay, he has the Echoing Truth now. That may be the 7th card. 3 forces, 3 blue cards, and an Echoing Truth is pretty unbeatable.
Pretty close to a lock.
And there comes both halves of the team. Vendilion Click will chump 1 half, chumps Iona. Jim goes to 4, Chris up to 12. Go to Chris's discard. And as long as he doesn't discard all his Force of Wills, even if he does discard all his Force of Wills, I think he's still okay. But
Chris just wants to make super sure here.
all right, he's gonna thought seize. It's Jace and Force of Will. All right, go ahead and take the Jace. It's the only thing that can deal with the creature. Yeah, but he pairs up Force of Will, blue card, Force of Will, blue card, Force of Will, blue card, and something else, and thought seize. Jim will crack the fetch land. A lot of show going on here. The game was pretty much decided a few minutes ago. But
Yeah. Well, Chris is, you know, again, just making sure.
yeah, both players being very methodical about it.
Another blue card, and there it is.
So Chris VanMeter up to 6-0. You said once again, really hot out of the gates of the tournament, and so far the fire hasn't died yet. He's up to 6-0. If he can rally off 1 more consecutive win, he will find himself in our top 8.
Yeah, within a hair's breadth of locking up a top 8 berth. And again,